Ethan Carver thought he knew the mountains better than anyone. He'd grown up hearing stories of strange lights, voices in the trees, and people who wandered into the woods never to return. But on the night he and his sister Maren followed a faint lantern glow along an unmarked trail in Appalachia, they realized the stories weren't warnings at all, they were invitations. And what waited in the dark wasn't folklore, it was watching, waiting, and it already knew their names. The mountains always felt alive. From the moment I stepped into that cabin, I could sense something beneath the earth, something that breathed through the trees and hummed in the wind. I told myself I came here for peace, for isolation, but the silence of Appalachia was never truly silent. It was layered with whispers, the kind that slipped into your ears and lingered long after the sound was gone. On my first night, I lay in bed with the lantern burning low. The cabin was small, barely more than one room and a drafty porch, but I thought it would be enough. Outside, the forest pressed close, dark branches tangled together like fingers. The woods didn't sound alive in the way I expected. No crickets, no owls, no rustling animals. Instead, there were patterns of sound, pauses too deliberate, like someone walking just beyond the tree line. I told myself it was deer, maybe even a bear, though my chest tightened with each slow step I thought I heard. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time my eyes shut, a noise pulled me back away, the creak of the porch boards, a faint tapping against the wall, a distant knock from inside the walls themselves. I sat up, staring at the wooden planks, wondering what could make that sound in the middle of nowhere. When I dared to get closer, the noise stopped, leaving me with nothing but my shallow breaths and the hiss of the lantern flame. The next morning did little to ease me. Mist clung low to the trees, curling through the branches like smoke. The air was heavy, too heavy for a mountain morning. I stepped outside, and the first thing I noticed was the mud, thick streaks of it across the porch, smeared as though dragged by something large. I crouched, touching the marks with my fingers, and felt the chill of wet earth. The shapes weren't paw prints. They weren't boots either. They looked more like long fingers pressed into the dirt. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to look away, convincing myself I was imagining things. By evening, the air shifted again. The quiet had grown sharper, more pointed. As the sun fell behind the mountains, shadows stretched too far, bending into shapes that looked wrong. My eyes kept catching faces in the bark of trees, faces I knew weren't there when I blinked. The woods seemed to lean closer, watching. I thought I could calm myself by walking outside with my flashlight, prove to my nerves there was nothing in the dark. The beam cut across the clearing, catching branches and stones, until it landed on something pale at the edge of the woods. At first, I thought it was a tree stripped of bark, but then I noticed the shape, a figure, tall, impossibly tall, standing still as though carved from the night itself. My throat closed, my body locking in place. I wanted to shout, to demand an answer, but no sound left my lips. The figure didn't move. It didn't tilt its head, it didn't shift, it simply watched me, though I couldn't see its face. My hand trembled, and the flashlight slipped. The beam cut away for only a second, but when I caught it again, the figure was gone. Just trees, endless trees swaying gently. I rushed back inside, my heart slamming against my ribs, every nerve screaming to lock the door. I lit the lantern again and sat near the window, staring out into the dark. The woods were silent. Nothing moved. Slowly I began to believe I had imagined it, that my mind was bending shapes out of fear. I forced myself to lie down, though I left the lantern burning bright beside me. When dawn came, pale and cold, I let myself breathe again. But then I saw the marks on the glass. Muddy handprints smeared across the cabin windows, so high up they reached almost to the roof. They were long, crooked, and wet, as though pressed there only moments before I woke. I stood frozen, staring at them, every ounce of denial burning away. Something had been here in the night, something that wanted me to know it could reach me whenever it chose. I told myself that morning I would leave, that I would pack what little I had and find the road back down the mountain. But when I stepped outside, the world looked unfamiliar, like the forest had shifted in the night. The dirt trail I had driven up days before was gone, swallowed by trees that stood too close together, their trunks twisted as if they had grown overnight. The cabin sat in a small clearing, but every direction I looked seemed the same endless trees, stretching deeper and darker. No sign of the path that should have led back to town. I forced myself to keep walking, determined to find some landmark. My boots crunched through leaves that seemed damp, even though it hadn't rained. The air was still heavy and it carried a smell of moss and wet stone. That silence pressed on me harder than anything else. No birds, no insects, not even the distant rush of wind, just the steady sound of my own breathing and the faint crackle of each step I took. It was then that I noticed the carvings. At first, I thought they were natural scars in the bark, but the longer I stared, the more deliberate they became. Symbols cut deep into the tree spiral's crooked lines, shapes that bent in ways that hurt my eyes if I looked too long. Some of them were old, the wood dark around the cuts, but others were fresh, the shavings still curled at the base of the trunk. I ran my fingers over one of the spirals, and the bark felt strangely warm beneath my hand, as though the tree itself had a pulse. The forest seemed to thicken the farther I walked, and I began to feel it closing around me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain that the shapes between the trees were not all shadows. I thought I caught glimpses of pale movement, something just beyond my vision, slipping behind a trunk whenever I turned my head. That was when I heard it, a sound so faint at first I thought it was inside my own mind, a low hum, steady and deep, vibrating through the air. It seemed to come from every direction, wrapping around me, pressing against my chest. I froze, the hairs on my arms lifting. The longer it went on, the more I realized it wasn't just sound, it was rhythm, not random, not wind. It felt like a chant, carried on invisible voices that never broke for breath. My legs locked in place, but my body screamed to run. Just as I thought I would collapse under the weight of the noise, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. My ears rang with the absence of it, my own heartbeat too loud, too uneven. Then came something new, a whistle, a tune, broken and wrong, rising and falling like someone playing a song without knowing how. The sound drifted closer, threading through the trees. It wasn't rushed or frantic, it was patient, almost playful. I ran. I didn't think, didn't choose a direction. I just pushed my legs forward, the whistle weaving through the forest, as though it followed me no matter where I turned. My chest burned, and my eyes stung with tears. But I didn't stop until I saw the cabin again. I stumbled through the clearing and slammed the door behind me, pressing my ear against the wood. The whistle cut off immediately, as if whoever or whatever had been making it had been waiting for me to return. I stood there for a long time, barely breathing, too afraid to look outside. Finally, I forced myself to lift the curtain just enough to see. The clearing was empty, the trees still and quiet. For a moment, I almost convinced myself I had imagined everything. Then my eyes dropped to the dirt just outside the door. There, etched perfectly into the ground, was a spiral. Fresh, neat, drawn as though by careful hands. My stomach twisted so hard I thought I would be sick. The marks on the trees hadn't just been old carvings left behind by strangers. Someone was here now. Someone had followed me back, and they wanted me to know they could reach my door as easily as carving a line into the dirt. The clock on the wall had stopped at midnight, its hand frozen like a wound. I stared at it for a long time, as if my eyes could force it to move. The second hand refused. The numbers sat there, white on black, and the silence in the cabin swelled to fill every space. Time felt wrong in those hours, thick and syrupy, like I was moving through fog. My breath sounded too loud. My skin prickled, and the lantern's light felt small and thin against the dark that gathered in the corners. Sleep came in fits and jumps. I would nod off, then snap awake with a feeling of someone standing over me. My limbs hummed with a tiredness that no rest could fix. The air tasted like wet leaves and something older, something that smelled like soil turned after a long winter. Shadows pressed close to the floorboards as if they wanted to crawl inside the planks and push their way up through the gaps. Then the footsteps started. Not outside, not on the porch inside. Heavy, slow steps that moved across the room and paused by the door. The sound of shoes on wood that I could not see made every hair on my neck stand up. My heart hammered like a panic drum in my chest. I held my breath and tried to listen beyond the pounding, but the steps circled, patient and deliberate, tracing a path around the room as if someone measured my space before they reached me. I kept the lantern close, like a talisman. The flame trembled, casting reaching shadows that crawled like insects across the ceiling. The footsteps stopped at the closet. I watched the door with all the attention I had left, waiting to see what would happen. The latch scratched as it began to move, the wood side open, slow and careful. For a moment the black within the closet looked like any other patch of shadow, solid, deep, impossible to read. Then something unfolded from the darkness. It did not come at me like a thing in a story with a face and a roar. It slid out, elbows bent wrong, limbs long in a way that made my eyes ache. Its shoulders scraped the ceiling like it had been contorted to fit. I could not tell where its skin ended and the dark began. It moved with a softness that should have been harmless and a wrongness that made my gut go cold. My mouth was dry. The lantern flared as if in protest, and for a fraction of a second the thing was plain to see, pale water slick, its joints bending in directions that animals do not bend. The light died down as I blinked and the closet stood empty. The door was ajar, swinging slightly, the echo of a sigh drifting from inside it. For a breath I thought I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I had dozed and dreamed. Maybe I had conjured shapes from fear. But fear can plant real things, too. It can make patterns that the world then follows. On the floor, there was a damp smear, a handprint pressed into the wood as if someone had leaned for support and then dragged their fingers away. The shape was too long and too narrow to be mine. The wet dark spread into the grain of the wood, and my stomach churned with a slow, sick lurch. I traced the path with my eyes, following the smear like a map. It led straight to the foot of my bed. I climbed in, every muscle tense, and pulled the blanket up to my chin, though it did nothing for the cold that lived in my bones. The handprint stopped at the frame, but there was a thin line of water beneath the mattress that I could not explain. I wanted to flip the bed, to check under it, to prove that nothing could be hiding there. I sat very still instead, listening to the boards breathe, the house settling. as if it were trying to pretend nothing had happened. I tried to count the minutes, but the clock still would not move. My breath fogged in front of me. The room felt smaller than it had just hours before, as if the walls had leaned in to hear what I would do next. The hum that I had heard in the woods returned, low and distant. It vibrated the nails on the floor and brushed the back of my teeth. It felt like a voice without words, a pressure that reached into the hollow of my chest. Something brushed the underside of the bed. Not with force, not with a slam, just a soft, deliberate contact, like fingertips testing the edge of a shore. I wanted to call out, to demand that whatever it was stop, but my voice drowned in the hum. The brush came again, closer. My muscles locked. My hand moved of its own accord, reaching toward the mattress as if to pull it closer, to make the world safe by an action too small to matter. The mattress dipped under my fingers, as if something on the other side pressed up, not weight but resistance, like palms pushing from beneath. The skin of my hand went cold. I felt breath against my wrist, sticky and wet, and a pressure that circled around my pulse. For the first time I saw my own hand clearly in the lantern light, pale, trembling, and speckled with mud I did not remember touching. Under my fingernails the dirt was dark and fresh, the scent of it sharp in the air. I jerked my hand back, and in the instant my fingers left the mattress, a sound like fingernails scratching at wood rose from below. The noise came from the hollow beneath the floorboards, under the very place I lay. It scratched in a slow rhythm, the same spiral pattern I had seen carved in the trees and traced in the dirt outside. The sound ended with a soft pop, like something finding purchase. I reached down, unable to stop myself, and ran my fingers along the seam between the mattress and the frame. There, pressed into the cloth, was an imprint, a small, crooked spiral traced into the fabric as though something had pushed its finger through and left the pattern behind. It was damp and cooling, and as my skin touched it, I felt something small and cold slide along my ankle, under the blanket, brushing the hair of my leg with something that moved with intention. I turned my head to look, and in the corner of the room, under the shadow of the closet, something moved with a patient slowness. It reached up, scraping the floorboards with nails that grew out of the wood like roots. It did not come fully into the light. It stretched a hand toward me long, and ending in shapes that were not quite fingers, and for a second, when that hand hovered over the blanket, I thought it paused to listen to my heartbeat. When it touched my ankle, the world narrowed to the sound of that beat in the cold that wrapped my limb. I felt a pressure, a pull, not just on my skin but inside my chest, as if something reached through the bed and tried to take a piece of me. My breath hitched, and the lantern sputtered. The last thing I remember before the light almost died was a whisper against my wrist. That was not a sound, but a knowing that I was no longer the only thing that belonged in that room. By the time the fourth night came, I no longer trusted the walls of the cabin. Every board, every beam felt like it was shifting around me, bending closer to listen. My reflection in the small cracked mirror on the wall looked wrong, skin pale and damp, eyes ringed with shadows, hair clinging to my face, as though I had been standing in rain. I barely recognized myself. My stomach ached with emptiness. I hadn't eaten since the first day. The only thing I thought about was lasting until morning, though I could no longer tell when morning truly came. When I stepped outside, I hoped for air, but the clearing felt smaller, the trees thicker and closer than they had ever been. No matter which way I turned, the woods pressed in, identical in every direction. I thought of the road that should have led down the mountain, but it was gone, swallowed by trunks that leaned like they wanted to keep me here. I pushed into the forest anyway, my boots sinking into soil that seemed too soft, almost spongy beneath me. The symbols carved into the bark had multiplied. Spirals, jagged lines, crooked shapes cut deep into the trees, all arranged as though they were forming a path of their own. Some of the carvings looked newer than before, the bark still raw, the edges bleeding sap like wounds. My fingertips brushed one without thinking, and it burned, a pulse throbbing up my arm as though I had touched something alive. I yanked my hand back, but the sting lingered, and when I looked down, a faint spiral reddened the skin of my palm. I stumbled away, but the forest had no end. Hours could have passed, or minutes, I couldn't tell any more. My breath came sharp, my throat dry. Then I heard it again, the low humming, louder than before, pressing against me from every direction. It vibrated through the air, through the ground, through my bones. It didn't sound distant now. It sounded inside me. The humming grew until it wasn't just sound but voices layered together, chanting words I couldn't understand. My name surfaced in the noise, whispered in 100 different tones, curling around me like smoke. I staggered back toward the cabin, desperate for some place to hide, but the trees seemed to twist as I moved. Branches shifted, closing in, guiding me back whether I wanted it or not. When I finally stumbled into the clearing, the cabin loomed dark and waiting, its windows glinting faintly as if eyes were staring from within. I rushed inside and slammed the door, but the air in the room was no safer. My chest heaved, and that was when I saw it, letters carved into the wood of the door itself, fresh gouges sharp and splintered, spelling my name over and over again, dozens of times, some deep enough to break the grain, others so shallow they looked like they were still being scratched. My fingers hovered over the cuts, The wood was warm. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. My breath shook, and I pressed my ear against the door. At first there was only silence, but then something pressed back from the other side, a steady, pulsing rhythm, a heartbeat. I stumbled away, my back hitting the wall, my eyes locked on the door as it throbbed with that impossible sound. The walls shivered, the glass rattled in the windows, and the humming outside grew deafening. It was everywhere, inside and out, drowning my own thoughts until I wasn't sure which beat belonged to me anymore. Then the door groaned. The frame cracked as though something immense leaned against it, straining to break through. I watched in horror as thin splinters spidered down the wood, each one followed by a long, deliberate push. The heartbeat on the other side grew stronger, syncing with mine, each thud louder than the last. My lantern flickered, shadows stretching long and sharp across the walls. The carved letters seemed to crawl. The spirals on the trees outside burned in my vision even though I couldn't see them. The whole cabin trembled, and I realized it wasn't just something at the door. The entire place was alive, pulsing, waiting, as though it had always belonged to something else, and I was only a trespasser within its ribs. The crack in the door widened, the sound of wood splitting filling the room. Cold air bled through, carrying the smell of wet earth and rot. I pressed myself into the farthest corner, heart hammering, as something on the other side pushed harder. The door bowed inward, the heartbeat thundered. And then, with a final groan, the wood began to split open. Something was coming through. I don't remember falling asleep, if I even did at all. One moment I was pressed against the wall of the cabin, listening to the door split under something's weight, and the next I was outside, barefoot, standing in the clearing with the grass wet beneath my feet. The cabin glowed faintly behind me, though no lantern burned inside. My mind clawed for an explanation, but my body wouldn't move the way I wanted it to. It was as if the earth itself had pulled me from my shelter and placed me where it wanted me to stand. The woods no longer looked like woods. They breathed. The trees leaned together, their branches forming arches, tunnels, and crooked shapes that resembled faces, and those faces were not still. Eyes blinked open in the bark, hollow and pale, tracking me where I stood. Mouths split the trunks in jagged smiles, stretching far too wide. In every direction they watched, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The humming came again, but louder now, thick as if the mountains themselves were singing through stone and root. It vibrated in my chest until I could no longer hear my own heartbeat. My knees trembled, and my breath came shallow, but my body began to move. I did not choose to walk. My legs dragged forward as though strings pulled them. Every step sank into damp earth, and the ground gave way, soft and warm, like flesh beneath my feet. The trees opened into a wider space I had never seen before, though I had walked these woods in circles for days. In the center was a clearing scarred with spirals carved deep into the soil, black lines etched so wide they looked like gashes. The earth smelled raw, metallic, as though something old had been unearthed. I stood at the edge, trembling, as my eyes caught movement. It was there. The tall figure I had seen once before, pale and bent at an angle that defied every rule of bone and muscle. Its arms hung low, longer than its legs, dragging across the soil as it shifted. Its head was cocked sharply, so sharply I thought its neck must snap, yet it did not move with pain. It moved with purpose, its body swaying as if in rhythm with the humming. My mind screamed to run, but my feet carried me forward. I stepped into the spiral, each line carved into the dirt glowing faintly as I crossed it. Behind me, the forest seemed to lean in closer. Faces filled the trees, pale and watching. They stretched their mouths open in unison, and though no sound came from them, I felt their breath sweep across the clearing. The humming stopped. The silence was so complete it made my ears ring. The figure lifted one long arm and raised its hand, palm out, as if it were commanding everything to pause. The forest obeyed. Even the wind held its breath. The figure's hand bent, beckoning. My chest tightened until it felt like my ribs would crack. I wanted to scream, to plead, but my throat locked shut. My vision blurred as I dropped to my knees in the spiral's center. The earth beneath me pulsed like a living thing, each beat in time with my racing heart. Then the ground opened. The soil shifted and split, black voids tearing through the spiral lines. Cold air rushed upward, smelling of rot and something deeper, something that had never seen light. Hands, pale and thin, clawed up from the fissures. Dozens of them. They reached, not for the figure, not for the trees, but for me. Their grip was wet and strong, dragging at my arms, my legs, my waist. I thrashed, but every movement sank me deeper. I twisted my head toward the cabin. It was gone. Nothing stood in the clearing except the spirals, the trees, and that tall, watching figure. The faces in the trunks leaned closer, mouths opening wider. They were waiting, expecting. The hands pulled harder, yanking me into the ground inch by inch. Soil filled my mouth when I tried to scream, thick and choking. My nails clawed at the earth, but every handful turned to mud. The figure tilted its head farther, impossible, grotesque, as though amused by my struggle. As the last of my body slipped beneath the surface, a final thought struck me, a memory of those symbols carved in the trees, the spirals, the marks left outside the cabin. They had not been warnings. They had been invitations, rituals, and I had followed every step of the path laid out for me. The soil closed over my head, the cold swallowing me whole, but just before the darkness claimed me, I felt something press against my ear. A voice, not spoken but placed directly inside my skull, whispered my name. It sounded like me. And then there was nothing but silence.